By the beginning of 1945, Adolf Hitler was no longer directing a war of expansion. He was managing a collapse. Germany still existed on maps, but not in reality. The territory controlled by the Reich was shrinking at a speed no general staff could explain away. Railways were shattered, fuel depots empty, and entire army groups existed only on paper. Yet inside Hitler's headquarters, the language of victory had not disappeared. It had become ritual. Daily briefings continued. Maps were updated. Arrows were redrawn. But the information arriving from the front lines no longer described a functioning war. It described fragmentation. In the east, the Red Army was preparing an offensive unlike anything Germany had faced before. Hitler had been warned. In late 1944, intelligence reports indicated massive Soviet troop concentrations beyond the Vistula River, tank armies, artillery formations, supply columns stretching for kilometers. This was not a probing attack. It was preparation for annihilation. Hitler dismissed the warnings. He believed the Soviets were exhausted. He believed Germany's remaining forces could slow them. Above all, he believed that holding ground mattered more than preserving armies. That belief would prove fatal. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet winter offensive began. Within days, German defenses collapsed across vast sections of the Eastern Front. Entire divisions were overrun. Communications failed. Command structures disintegrated. Units retreated without orders, while others were encircled and destroyed. This was not a tactical defeat. It was a systemic failure. For the first time since 1941, the German army was not retreating to regroup. It was being erased. Reports reaching Hitler grew darker by the hour. Cities once considered secure fell in rapid succession. Warsaw was lost. Krakow followed. The front line no longer resembled a line at all. It was a wave. Hitler reacted by issuing counter-orders that demanded the impossible. He forbade withdrawals. He declared cities to be fortresses. He ordered commanders to fight to the last man. But orders could not replace fuel. Declarations could not create ammunition, and ideology could not stop tanks. By the end of January, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers. The distance between the Red Army and Berlin was shrinking faster than Hitler's staff could comprehend. For the first time, Berlin was no longer symbolic. It was vulnerable. Inside Hitler's inner circle, concern began to replace confidence. Some generals attempted to explain the scale of the disaster. They spoke of destroyed units, lost equipment, and the impossibility of stabilizing the front. Hitler did not accept their conclusions. Instead, he accused them of defeatism. This was the beginning of his isolation. As February approached, the situation in the West worsened as well. The Western Allies pushed steadily toward the Rhine. Air superiority ensured that German movement during daylight was nearly impossible. Germany was being compressed. The strategy Hitler had relied on, delaying, dividing enemies, buying time, had failed completely. The war was no longer flexible, it had become mechanical. Pressure increased from all sides. Inside his headquarters, Hitler still spoke of counteroffensives, of reserves that would arrive, of weapons that would change the balance. But fewer and fewer people believed him, and fewer still were willing to contradict him. The war was not yet over, but for the first time, it was no longer winnable. What Hitler had not yet admitted, what he still resisted internally, was that Germany had already crossed the point of no return. The realization had begun. It simply had not fully arrived. By February 1945, Adolf Hitler was still issuing orders, but the system meant to carry them out was collapsing beneath him. The German command structure no longer functioned as a unified force. Army Group headquarters operated in isolation. Communication lines were unreliable. Units reported directly to Berlin because intermediate commands had ceased to exist. What remained was not coordination, it was confusion. Hitler's response was not adaptation, but control. He centralized decision-making to an extreme degree. Movements of divisions, sometimes even battalions, required his personal approval. Maps were adjusted daily in his presence. Arrows were drawn and redrawn, often ignoring reports from the field. This created an illusion. From inside his headquarters, the war still appeared manageable. From the front lines, it was chaos. Generals who attempted to explain the reality faced increasing hostility. Bad news was interpreted as disloyalty. Requests for withdrawal were treated as weakness. Honest assessments were replaced with carefully worded optimism. Over time, commanders learned a lesson. Survival depended on telling Hitler what he wanted to hear. This marked a turning point. The German military had once relied on flexible command and independent initiative. Now initiative was punished. Obedience, even to impossible orders, became the only acceptable behavior. In the east, the Red Army continued its advance. German forces attempted to form defensive pockets, but without reserves or air support, these efforts collapsed quickly. Cities were declared strongholds. Garrisons were ordered to hold at all costs. Most were bypassed or destroyed. Meanwhile, in the west, the situation deteriorated rapidly. On March 7, 1945, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. This event, though tactically limited, carried enormous psychological weight. The Rhine had been crossed. For years, Hitler had considered the Rhine Germany's final natural defense. Once breached, there would be no meaningful barrier left between the Allies and the German heartland. Hitler reacted with fury. He ordered immediate counterattacks, demanded the bridge be destroyed, and accused officers of incompetence and treason. None of this changed the outcome. Within days, Allied forces poured across the river. From that moment onward, Germany was split open. Despite this, Hitler continued to plan operations as if time remained. He spoke of regrouping units that no longer existed. He believed that holding territory mattered more than preserving lives. The disconnect between command and reality widened. By late March, Hitler's physical and mental state began to show visible decline. He slept little. His hands trembled. His movements were rigid. Witnesses later described his presence as tense and distant. Yet his grip on decision-making tightened. Evacuation plans were proposed. They were rejected. Retreat options were discussed. They were forbidden. Hitler believed that abandoning territory accelerated defeat. In truth, refusing withdrawal ensured destruction. Inside Germany, civilians were caught in the collapse. Transportation systems failed, food shortages intensified, cities were subjected to constant bombardment. Berlin itself became increasingly isolated. Rail connections were cut, fuel deliveries ceased. The capital, once the administrative heart of the Reich, began to resemble a fortress under siege. Still, Hitler remained convinced that something would change. He believed that disagreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would escalate. He believed that fear of communism would lead to negotiation. He believed that endurance itself could produce opportunity. These beliefs had no basis in reality. The Allies were not divided, they were coordinated, and their objective was absolute defeat. By early April, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin. The final encirclement began. Escape routes closed one by one. Communications with external units failed. Reports from the front stopped arriving. Hitler was now confined underground. The illusion of control remained, but the physical world had closed in. The war was no longer being fought on maps. It was being fought in streets, basements, and ruins. And soon, even control itself would disappear. By mid-April 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital city. It was a battlefield. Soviet artillery encircled the city from multiple directions. Shelling was constant. Entire districts vanished under bombardment. Streets that once carried parades were now choked with rubble, burned vehicles, and the remains of buildings reduced to skeletons. Above ground, resistance continued in fragments. Below ground, the center of German command had withdrawn completely into the Führer bunker. Hitler now lived beneath the ruins of his own capital. Maps still covered the walls, but the information they displayed had little connection to reality. Units were marked in positions they had abandoned days earlier. Arrows suggested movements that could no longer occur. The war had become abstract. In these final days, Hitler still believed that Berlin could be relieved. His hope rested on a counterattack planned by General Felix Steiner. Steiner's forces were ordered to strike Soviet units from the north, break the encirclement, and reopen a corridor into the city. On paper, it appeared possible. In reality, Steiner had no forces capable of carrying out the order. The divisions assigned to him were shattered. Many units existed only in name. Some had no ammunition, others had no fuel. Several had already been overrun. Steiner did not attack. On April 22, 1945, Hitler was informed that the counterattack had failed, not in battle, but in preparation. It had never begun. During a military briefing inside the bunker, the truth finally surfaced. For the first time, Hitler confronted the fact that no relief would come. No reserves remained. No new armies could be formed. No strategic maneuver could reverse the situation. Witnesses later described the scene as unlike anything they had seen before. Hitler did not shout. He did not rage. He collapsed. He admitted openly that the war was lost. He acknowledged that his decisions had failed. He stated that Germany could not be saved. This was the moment. Not the suicide, not the surrender, but the realization. From that point forward, Hitler's focus changed. Victory was no longer discussed. Strategy shifted from winning to controlling the end. Evacuation plans were again raised. Hitler rejected them. He refused to leave Berlin, not because escape was impossible, but because survival without power was unacceptable to him. The Reich had been built around his authority. Its collapse meant the collapse of his purpose. Above ground, the battle intensified. Soviet forces pushed deeper into the city. Street fighting became brutal and chaotic. Buildings changed hands repeatedly. Civilians were trapped between advancing armies and collapsing infrastructure. German resistance continued, but it was no longer coordinated. Orders were fragmented. Leadership was absent. Units fought in isolation, unaware of the broader situation. Inside the bunker, Hitler withdrew further into himself. He dictated political statements. He revised his testament. He made final appointments to positions that no longer held meaning. The machinery of government continued, but the state it governed no longer existed. As April drew to a close, the sounds of battle moved closer. The bunker shook under bombardment. Electricity failed intermittently. Communications ceased almost entirely. Berlin was being consumed, and Hitler knew it. The realization that there was no way left did not come with drama.
It came with resignation, with silence, with the understanding that every option had already been exhausted. What remained was inevitability.
Outside, the battle for Berlin continued for several more days. Soldiers fought on without central command. Civilians endured the final destruction of the city. The machinery of war continued even after the leadership that began it had disappeared. Germany's surrender followed soon after. But the end of Hitler did not end the war instantly. It ended direction. The remaining conflict became a process of disarmament rather than strategy. In retrospect, the significance of the day Hitler realized he had no way left lies not in the manner of his death, but in the failure that preceded it. The Third Reich did not fall because of one battle, one betrayal, or one decision. It collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. A system built on absolute control could not adapt when reality changed. When options disappeared, the system had no response. The realization in April 1945 was the final stage of that failure. By the time Hitler accepted that there was no way left, there was nothing left to accept. By April 1945, the bunker beneath Berlin had become a sealed world of concrete, smoke, and collapsing illusions. Above ground, the city no longer resembled the capital. Streets were rivers of rubble. Buildings burned without anyone left to extinguish the flames. The sound of Soviet artillery was no longer distant. It was constant, echoing through the earth itself. Hitler spent hours staring at maps that no longer reflected reality. Entire divisions existed only as names on paper. Orders were issued to armies that had already been destroyed. Couriers returned with silence or did not return at all. For the first time, even the most loyal officers could see it clearly. There was no longer a Germany to command. Inside the bunker, time lost meaning. Days and nights blended into one long moment of waiting. Hitler's physical condition worsened rapidly. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His walk had slowed to a shuffle. Witnesses later described a man who looked decades older than his years, his voice softer, his confidence gone. Yet even then, he refused to publicly admit defeat. On April 22, during a military briefing, the illusion finally collapsed. When informed that the last planned counterattack would never happen, Hitler erupted in rage. He shouted, accused his generals of betrayal, then abruptly fell silent. In that moment, according to those present, he acknowledged the truth. Quietly, almost to himself, the war was lost. From that day on, his decisions were no longer about victory, but about legacy. He spoke increasingly of history, of how future generations would judge him. He ordered documents burned, personal files disappeared into flames. Entire archives were destroyed in the bunker's corridors. What could not be erased physically, he hoped would dissolve into confusion. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. There was no celebration, no music, no future plans. It was an act that symbolized finality rather than hope, a closing chapter rather than a beginning. That same night, he dictated his last political testament. In it, he blamed others for the war, denied responsibility, and repeated beliefs that had already led Europe to ruin. It was not a message of regret, but of defiance. Above them, Soviet troops were only blocks away. On April 30th, the bunker fell silent. Guards were ordered away. What happened next would become one of the most examined moments of the 20th century. According to official accounts, Hitler took his own life alongside Eva Braun. Their bodies were quickly carried to the garden above, doused in fuel, and set on fire as shells exploded nearby.
But war leaves chaos, and chaos leaves questions. The remains recovered days later were fragmentary, burned, incomplete. Soviet forces kept the discovery secret. Statements contradicted each other. Evidence was classified. Even Allied governments were left uncertain. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread. Had Hitler truly died there? Or had the confusion of Berlin's collapse allowed something else to happen? For decades, fragments of testimony, missing records, and conflicting forensic reports fueled speculation. Some claimed he escaped. Others believed the truth had been deliberately buried, not just under rubble, but under politics. What remains undeniable is this: whether he died in the bunker or not, the man who once controlled Europe had reached a point with no exit. Militarily defeated, politically isolated, abandoned by reality itself. Berlin fell days later. Germany surrendered soon after. The war ended, but the questions did not. Hitler's end was not just the death of a man, it was the collapse of an idea that had consumed millions of lives. And in the silence that followed the guns, the world was left to search for truth among ashes, ruins, and unanswered doubts. This was not a dramatic ending. It was a closed room, a sealed bunker, and a chapter that ended without witnesses the world could fully trust. And that is why even today, the final days of Adolf Hitler remain one of history's most scrutinized and disputed endings.